We brought these clothes for you. Please take them.
ハルワのためにこれらの服を持ってきましたね。どうぞしょ。
All right, take a deep breath now. It's all right. Just breathe deep like the doctor says.
September 1945. The air is still heavy with heat along the edge of a former military compound in the Philippines. The war has ended, but the ground does not yet know it. A line of women stands quietly in the open yard. Some wear faded cotton kimonos, torn at the sleeves. Others are wrapped in patched uniforms meant for men, hanging loose on thin shoulders. Months of captivity have bleached the fabric and drained the color from their faces. No one speaks. Their eyes stay lowered, fixed on the dust. Across from them, American soldiers move without ceremony. A wooden crate is dragged forward. Its lid is pried open with a short metallic crack. Inside are stacks of folded clothing. Clean, plain, unmarked. Shirts, dresses, undergarments. Items meant for ordinary life. An interpreter steps forward, his voice measured, careful. The words are translated. Slowly, the women do not move. Some think it is a trick. Others believe it is humiliation. Many have been taught that capture means disgrace beyond survival. They have been told that mercy is impossible. Then a single garment is lifted from the crate and held out. Not thrown, not demanded, offered. In that moment, the war narrows to a quiet, human threshold, one that leads directly into how these women came to stand there at all. By the time these women were taken into American custody, Imperial Japan had been at war for nearly a decade. The conflict was not only fought on battlefields. It was embedded into daily life, education, and belief. From the early 1930s onward, Japan's leadership framed war as a sacred national duty. The state fused military service with spiritual obligation. Loyalty to the emperor was absolute. Death in his name was honorable. Survival without honor was not. This ideology hardened as the war expanded across China and into the Pacific. By 1941, Japan was mobilized as a total war society. Factories, farms, schools, and homes were all subordinated to the military effort. Women were not on the front lines, but they were not outside the war. They were drawn into it systematically, deliberately, and ideologically. Japanese women were expected to embody endurance. They were trained to support the state through labor, caregiving, and moral example. Many worked in munitions factories. Others served as nurses, clerks, and communications aides for the Imperial Army and Navy. In occupied territories and forward bases, women were present as medical staff, civil workers, and sometimes as families accompanying officers. By the later years of the war, teenage girls were organized into the Volunteer Fighting Corps, taught basic military drills, first aid, and resistance tactics. Underlying all of this was a single assumption. Capture was unthinkable. Imperial training materials were explicit. Soldiers were instructed never to surrender. Manuals described capture as worse than death. For women, the warnings were even more severe. Allied troops were portrayed as brutal, immoral, and racially inferior. Propaganda emphasized sexual violence, public humiliation, and torture as inevitable consequences of falling into enemy hands. Posters, radio broadcasts, and lectures reinforced the message relentlessly. Fear was not incidental. It was a weapon. In schools and civil defense classes, Women were taught that their bodies represented the honor of the nation. To be captured alive was to betray family, emperor, and country. Suicide was framed not as despair, but as duty. Cyanide vials were issued to some civilian defense units. Others were instructed in methods of self-inflicted death using knives, grenades, or improvised means. Mothers were told to kill their children before surrendering them to the enemy. By 1944, as American forces closed in on Japan's outer defenses, these teachings moved from theory to reality. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, entire civilian populations were drawn into the fighting. Women and girls were ordered to assist troops, carry ammunition, treat the wounded, or serve as lookouts. As defeat became inevitable, mass suicides followed. Thousands jumped from cliffs or detonated grenades in their arms. Many did, so believing the alternative was unspeakable. Yet not all died. Some were separated from military units during bombardment. Others were wounded, buried under debris, or left behind during chaotic retreats. A few actively chose survival, despite everything they had been taught. When American troops advanced through shattered villages and caves, they began encountering Japanese women alive, hiding, starving, terrified. These first encounters were tense and unpredictable. Women emerged from tunnels clutching knives or broken glass. Some refused food. Others screamed when approached. A number attempted suicide in front of advancing soldiers, even after the fighting had passed. Many were so indoctrinated that they could not comprehend restraint. They expected immediate violence. Instead, they were disarmed, separated, guarded. For the American forces, this was unfamiliar ground. The Pacific War had rarely involved large numbers of female captives. Japanese resistance had been so absolute that surrender was rare. Now, as the war turned decisively against Japan, a new reality emerged, one in which women, shaped by ideology and fear, began entering captivity for the first time. And with their capture, the collision between two radically different visions of war was about to become unavoidable. The moment Japanese women began appearing in American custody, the war entered an unfamiliar administrative and moral space. The United States had prepared extensively for the handling of prisoners of war. Its doctrine was shaped by international law, logistical necessity, and a conscious effort to differentiate itself from Axis practices. American forces operated under the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, which outlined standards for shelter, food, medical care, and protection from abuse. While Imperial Japan had signed, but not ratified the convention, the United States treated it as binding. In theory, the rules applied to all enemy prisoners. In practice, the Pacific War strained those principles. The brutality of Japanese combat tactics, atrocities committed against Allied POWs, and a near absence of surrender-hardened attitudes among American troops. Yet official policy remained clear. Prisoners were to be disarmed, secured, medically evaluated, and processed, not punished. Female prisoners complicated that framework. American manuals had little guidance for handling large numbers of enemy women. The European theater offered few parallels. Most Japanese women captured in the Pacific were not uniformed soldiers, but civilians, auxiliaries, or medical staff. Their legal status often fell into gray areas between civilian internees and military detainees. Civil affairs and military government units were tasked with improvising procedures as situations developed. Medical policy came first. Captured women were routinely examined by Army medical personnel, often under extreme conditions. Malnutrition, dehydration, and untreated wounds were common. Tropical diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and skin infections spread rapidly in caves and encampments. Hygiene was a priority not only for humanitarian reasons, but to prevent outbreaks among guards and nearby units. Clothing quickly became a problem. Many women wore garments that were unsanitary, infested with lice, or falling apart. Some had been wearing the same clothes for months. Others had fled bombardment with only what they could carry. In medical reports from Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa, U.S. doctors noted that lack of clean clothing complicated treatment and recovery. Infection rates rose when wounds could not be properly cleaned or covered. Civil affairs officers responded pragmatically. Supply depots carried large quantities of basic clothing intended for displaced civilians. These were not luxury items. They were plain cotton garments, mass-produced, neutral in design. Their purpose was functional: warmth, hygiene, and decency. Distribution was often conducted in controlled settings, with interpreters present and female medical personnel used whenever possible. For Japanese women, this process was deeply unsettling. The act of undressing, even for medical reasons, carried profound cultural weight. Modesty was closely tied to honor. Exposure, especially in front of men or foreigners, was associated with shame. Many women resisted examinations. Some refused clothing outright, believing it was a prelude to abuse or mockery. Others were convinced the garments were contaminated or symbolic of surrender. American personnel documented these reactions carefully. After-action reports and medical logs repeatedly note fear responses: trembling, withdrawal, refusal to make eye contact. Interpreters reported that women believed accepting American clothing meant abandoning their identity. Some asked if they would be executed afterward. Others assumed they were being prepared for public humiliation. Still, the process continued. As fighting ended in certain areas and surrender became more widespread after August 1945, these improvised measures solidified into organized procedures. Collection points were established. Female prisoners were separated from men. Medical screening became standardized. Clothing distribution was scheduled and supervised. What had begun as ad hoc problem-solving became routine. By early September, in liberated zones across the Pacific, groups of Japanese women were being processed systematically for the first time in the war. They were registered, examined, issued clean garments, and assigned quarters. It was not an act of generosity in the abstract. It was administration, deliberate, controlled, and grounded in policy. Yet for the women standing in those yards, the meaning was far larger than the paperwork suggested. Because this was not just the first time they were treated as prisoners. It was the first time the world they had been taught to fear revealed a different face. And that revelation was about to unfold in ways no briefing manual had prepared either side for. The first emotion most Japanese women experienced in captivity was not relief. It was shame. They had been taught that surrender erased identity, that to be taken alive was to become less than human. Many believed their families would be informed of their cowardice, that their names would be struck from records, that their ancestors would turn away from them. In the holding areas, they avoided mirrors, avoided one another's eyes, avoided the future itself. Silence became a form of self-protection. Women sat with their backs straight, hands folded tightly in their laps, faces expressionless. Some did not speak for days. Others whispered prayers under their breath, not for rescue, but for disappearance. Interpreters noted that even when food was offered, many hesitated, unsure whether accepting kindness was another betrayal. Fear lingered beneath every movement. American soldiers were taller, louder, unfamiliar. Their uniforms, their boots, their equipment all reinforced the image that had been drilled into Japanese consciousness: overwhelming, predatory force. Even when guards kept distance, even when voices were calm, the fear remained. Some women flinched at sudden gestures. Others slept sitting upright, afraid to lie down. For these women, captivity was not merely physical. It was cultural exile. Clothing sat at the center of that rupture. In Japanese wartime culture, clothing was not decoration. It was structure. Kimono patterns reflected status, season, age. Even work garments carried meaning, how they were worn, folded, repaired. To remove one's clothing in front of others, especially men, violated deeply ingrained norms. Modesty was not individual preference. It was social obligation. American-issued garments disrupted that system entirely. They were plain, shapeless, without markings of rank, family, or region. There was no instruction on how to wear them correctly because there was no correct way. For women accustomed to knowing exactly how fabric should fall, where seams should sit, how sleeves should be folded, the clothing felt alien, almost aggressive in its simplicity. Exposure intensified the distress. Medical examinations required removal of lice-infested garments. Wounds had to be cleaned, bandages applied. Even when female nurses were present, the process stripped away layers of ritual protection. Some women wept quietly. Others froze completely, dissociating from the moment. A few refused outright, clutching their clothing as if it were armor. American observers often misread this reaction. Some assumed stubbornness. Others thought it was hostility. Few immediately understood that the clothing represented the last intact boundary of selfhood. To give it up was to stand unprotected, not just physically, but symbolically, a living contradiction of everything the imperial state had demanded of them. Yet the same clothing also carried another weight. It was clean. The smell of soap alone was shocking. Many women had not encountered it in months. Lice were constant companions in caves and camps. Skin diseases spread unchecked. Fabric stuck to wounds. The feel of freshly laundered cotton against the skin triggered unexpected responses: confusion, disbelief, sometimes tears without clear cause. These reactions rippled outward, observed carefully by American personnel. Military intelligence officers were trained to look for resistance, deception, and compliance. What they found instead was paralysis. The women were not defiant. They were not grateful. They were suspended between terror and incomprehension. Commanders began to realize this was not a tactical problem. It was a psychological one. The treatment of these women was not just shaping individual outcomes. It was shaping how surrender itself would unfold in the final weeks of the war. Every action, every procedure, every gesture carried consequences far beyond the enclosure fence. That realization pushed decision-making upward from guards and medics to staff officers and planners, where systems, not instincts, would determine what happened next. And it was there in those systems that policy would either collapse under emotion or become something far more deliberate. Once Japanese women began entering captivity in larger numbers, emotion alone could no longer guide American responses. The situation demanded structure. The tactical and administrative handling of prisoners had always been designed for male combatants. Processing lines, holding compounds, guard rotations, and interrogation schedules all reflected that assumption. Female captives disrupted those routines. They required separation, privacy, and additional supervision. Commanders had to adapt quickly, often in the midst of ongoing operations. Field orders were revised. Women were to be housed separately from male prisoners whenever possible. Female guards or nurses were assigned to assist with searches and medical examinations. Interpreters were instructed to explain procedures carefully, even if it slowed processing. Intelligence officers were warned that fear-driven compliance could not be mistaken for reliable information. These adjustments were not abstract ideals. They were tactical necessities. Unmanaged fear led to suicide attempts, refusal of food, and medical emergencies. Several after-action reports from Okinawa describe women attempting to strangle themselves with clothing or refusing water for days. Each incident consumed manpower and resources. Calm, predictable routines reduced those risks. Order became a form of prevention. Medical considerations reinforced the same conclusion. Japanese women arriving in custody often exhibited advanced malnutrition. Protein deficiency, anemia, and dehydration were common. Skin infections spread rapidly in humid climates. Many suffered untreated injuries from bombardment or cave collapses. Pregnancy further complicated care, particularly in areas where fighting had isolated civilians for months. Hygiene was the foundation of treatment. Lice carried typhus. Open sores invited infection. Clean clothing was not symbolic. It was clinical. Army doctors insisted that delousing and reclothing occur as early as possible. Temporary garments were issued while original clothing was disinfected or destroyed. Bandages, blankets, and soap became as essential as food rations. Triage decisions were made without regard to nationality. Medical logs show Japanese women receiving the same priority as Allied casualties once under care. Those with severe infections were isolated. Those near starvation were placed on controlled feeding schedules. In several documented cases, American doctors delayed the interrogation of female prisoners until their physical condition stabilized. This restraint extended beyond medicine. The Pacific War had been brutal beyond measure. American troops had endured ambushes, banzai charges, and the aftermath of atrocities committed against fellow soldiers and civilians. Revenge was not an abstract concept. It was a daily temptation. Commanders were acutely aware of that danger. Strict discipline was enforced. Fraternization was prohibited. Abuse was punishable. Guards were rotated to reduce emotional fatigue. Officers emphasized that these women were no longer enemies in combat, but wards of the military. Any violation of that principle risked undermining discipline across the unit. This was not idealism. It was control. The U.S. Army understood that how prisoners were treated would shape the final phase of the war. As surrender became more common, especially after the atomic bombings and the Emperor's broadcast, reports of humane treatment spread quickly among Japanese holdouts. Each intact surrender saved lives on both sides. Women became an unplanned but powerful signal. When Japanese soldiers learned that captured women were fed, clothed, and medically treated, the certainty of propaganda began to crack. Interpreters recorded stunned reactions from male prisoners when told that women had not been harmed. In some cases, that knowledge directly preceded group surrenders. By early September 1945, policy had matured into procedure. Processing centers operated on schedules. Clothing distribution was standardized. Medical screening became routine rather than reactive. What had begun as a series of improvisations now functioned as a system, deliberate, regulated, and carefully observed. But systems only matter when they're enacted. And for the women standing in those yards, waiting silently as crates were opened and garments unfolded, policy was no longer a document or a doctrine. It was about to become something tangible, something handed from one person to another. The moment when restraint, medicine, and command decisions converged into a single act. The moment when policy became action. The distribution of clothing did not happen in a single place or on a single day. It unfolded across the Pacific in fragments, similar scenes repeating under different skies. Saipan, July 1944. Okinawa, April 1945. Leyte, August 1945. And finally, in the weeks after Japan's surrender, across processing sites in the Philippines and southern Japan itself. In each location, the setting was unremarkable. Cleared yards, medical tents, school buildings stripped of furniture. American units varied. Army infantry divisions, Navy medical detachments, civil affairs teams. But the procedure was nearly identical. A holding area was established. Women were counted. Names, when known, were recorded. An interpreter explained what would happen next. Then the crates arrived. Quartermaster-issued boxes, stenciled with inventory numbers, were carried forward and opened. Inside were stacks of folded garments, cotton dresses, undershirts, slips, socks. No insignia, no national markings. Neutral colors meant for displaced civilians. When the first garment was lifted, the reaction was immediate and restrained. No one reached for it. The women stood motionless, eyes fixed downward. Some clasped their hands tightly against their bodies. Others folded their arms, as if bracing for impact. A few shook visibly, though the air was warm. Interpreters spoke again, slower this time. The words were simple: clean clothes. For health. For comfort. The silence did not break. Several women stepped backward. One turned her face to the wall. Another began whispering rapidly, eyes shut tight. A medic recorded in his log that 2 women refused to approach the table entirely, convinced the clothing was a test or a prelude to violence. An American nurse stepped forward. She held a dress out with both hands, not extending it aggressively, not dropping onto the ground. She waited. Minutes passed. Eventually, one woman moved. She was older than most, late 30s, perhaps early 40s. Her kimono was torn at the hem, stained beyond recognition. She did not meet anyone's eyes. She stepped forward, accepted the garment, and stood frozen, unsure what to do next. That moment shifted the room. Others followed slowly. Some took clothing and held it without unfolding it, as if afraid to look too closely. Several women began to cry quietly, tears falling without sound. One young girl pressed the fabric to her face and inhaled sharply, startled by the smell of soap. Confusion spread. Was this a trick? Was it temporary? Did accepting the clothing mean something irrevocable? Medical staff guided them gently toward partitioned areas for examinations and changing. Some women resisted at the threshold, gripping door frames, refusing to enter. Others complied mechanically, movements stiff and detached. Inside, reactions intensified. Reports describe women collapsing onto benches once out of sight, sobbing uncontrollably. Others sat rigid, staring at the floor, unable to process what was happening. A few tried to return the garments, insisting through interpreters that they had done something wrong. American personnel did not celebrate this moment. They observed it. Doctors noted elevated heart rates, shaking hands, dissociative behavior. Civil affairs officers recorded delays, refusals, and emotional breakdowns. Guards were instructed to keep distance, to avoid crowding, to maintain calm. What unfolded was not gratitude. It was rupture. The women had been prepared for brutality, for violation, for death. The clothing contradicted every expectation. It was clean. It was practical. It was given without demand or spectacle. That contradiction was destabilizing. One interpreter later wrote that several women asked the same question repeatedly. Why? Why give this? Why now? There was no answer that fit within the framework they had been taught. As garments replaced rags, something began to shift internally. The act was small in scale, but enormous in implication. It suggested that survival did not automatically require disgrace. That capture did not inevitably lead to cruelty. that the enemy they had feared might not behave as promised. But realization did not come all at once. For many women, it arrived as exhaustion, the kind that follows a long-held terror finally loosening its grip. They sat quietly after changing, holding their folded old clothing, unsure whether to discard it or keep it close. The yard grew quiet again, not the silence of fear this time, the silence of something breaking apart and waiting for what would replace it. What followed the distribution of clothing was not immediate relief. It was disorientation. For many Japanese women, the garments marked the first undeniable crack in the world they had been taught to accept. The rupture was not dramatic. There were no declarations, no visible transformations. Instead, the collapse happened quietly inside. Propaganda depends on certainty. This moment destroyed it. From childhood onward, these women had been instructed to expect degradation at the hands of the enemy. American soldiers were depicted as cruel, uncontrolled, and racially inferior. Mercy was portrayed as deception, kindness as manipulation, survival as shame. Yet the clothing was none of those things. It was not taken in exchange for information. It was not accompanied by threats. It was not used to humiliate. The simplicity of the act stripped away explanations. Psychological reports compiled by U.S. Army psychiatrists in late 1945 describe a recurring response among female prisoners: emotional numbness followed by delayed grief. Once immediate fear subsided, suppressed reactions surfaced. Women cried without clear cause. Others experienced headaches, dizziness, or sudden exhaustion. Several refused to eat for a day or more, overwhelmed by the implications of their survival. Interpreters became witnesses to quiet confessions. Women asked whether their families would be punished, whether the emperor knew they were alive, whether returning home was possible or permitted. Some expressed guilt not for being captured, but for discovering that the enemy had not behaved as promised. That realization was painful. One civil affairs report from Okinawa records a woman saying, through an interpreter, that she felt hollow. Everything she had prepared herself to endure had failed to materialize. The emotional armor built for suffering had no purpose. What remained was uncertainty. American personnel struggled to understand this reaction. They had expected hostility, fear, or gratitude. Instead, they encountered grief for a belief system that no longer functioned. The clothing became a symbol not of generosity, but of contradiction, proof that the war's moral boundaries were not as absolute as they had been told. Individual testimonies reflect this rupture clearly. A Japanese nurse captured near Naha wrote later that the moment she put on clean clothes, she realized she would live. That realization frightened her more than death had. Survival meant returning to a society that had taught her she should not exist anymore. Another woman, taken on Leyte, refused to discard her old garments even after receiving new ones. She folded them carefully and kept them beneath her pillow. When asked why, she replied that they reminded her of who she had been before capture, before certainty collapsed. Medical officers observed behavioral shifts within days. Women began sleeping lying down instead of sitting upright. Some asked for additional soap or water. A few began helping one another adjust unfamiliar clothing, teaching improvised ways to tie, fold, or secure garments that lacked traditional structure. These were small acts of adaptation, but they marked the return of agency. The propaganda did not vanish instantly. It eroded. Each neutral interaction, a meal delivered without comment, a wound treated without judgment, a garment handed over without demand, chipped away at the narrative of inevitable cruelty. The clothing episode stood out because it required trust at the most vulnerable level. It involved the body, identity, and dignity all at once. By the time processing concluded, Many women no longer expected immediate violence. Fear remained, but it was no longer absolute. The future, once imagined only as death or disgrace, reopened into uncertain space. When the shock finally settled, it did not resolve into clarity. It resolved into silence. The women sat in their new clothing, surrounded by unfamiliar order, waiting not for punishment, but for instruction. The war that had defined their lives was over. The beliefs that had sustained it were unraveling. And in the quiet that followed, the consequences of that unraveling were only beginning to emerge. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. Once the shock of initial processing passed, the effects of captivity began to register in measurable ways. Health outcomes were the first to change. Medical officers noted rapid improvement among Japanese women who had been suffering from prolonged malnutrition and exposure. Clean clothing reduced skin infections. Delousing dramatically lowered fever cases. Controlled feeding schedules stabilized digestive systems weakened by months of scarcity. Within days, swelling in hands and feet, common signs of protein deficiency, began to subside. Army medical logs from Okinawa and the Philippines describe a consistent pattern. Women who initially resisted treatment often became more cooperative once physical discomfort eased. Sleep improved. Dehydration declined. Small gains accumulated quickly. Clean garments allowed wounds to heal properly. Bandages stayed dry. Infection rates dropped. The Red Cross played a crucial role. As areas stabilized after surrender, Red Cross representatives conducted interviews and inspections. Their reports emphasized the psychological fragility of female prisoners, noting that fear responses persisted even in the absence of abuse. Many women startled easily. Some avoided conversation altogether. Others spoke rapidly, as if afraid silence would invite harm. Yet behavior began to shift. Within a week of receiving clean clothing and regular meals, many women showed signs of social re-engagement. They assisted one another during distributions. Older women helped younger ones adjust unfamiliar garments. Some began washing and folding clothes carefully, restoring routines that mirrored pre-war domestic life. These actions were not trivial. For women whose identities had been defined by service and sacrifice, regaining small forms of order signaled survival beyond mere existence. Hygiene became ritual again, not emergency. Clothing became something to care for, not simply endure. Interviews reveal cautious reinterpretation. When asked about their treatment, women often responded indirectly. Rather than praising American behavior, they framed their experiences in terms of surprise or confusion. Statements such as, "It was not as I expected," or "They did not do what we were told," appear repeatedly in Red Cross summaries. Direct expressions of relief were rare. Emotional restraint remained deeply ingrained. American observers noticed a gradual reduction in suicide attempts. Early in captivity, self-harm incidents were frequent enough to warrant special monitoring. By late September 1945, such incidents declined sharply among women who had undergone full medical processing. Doctors attributed this change to physical stabilization combined with reduced fear of immediate violence. Trust, however, developed unevenly. Some women never fully relaxed. They complied with procedures but avoided unnecessary interaction. Others remained convinced their treatment was temporary, a prelude to later punishment. Still, the absence of abuse undermined absolute despair. Civil affairs officers recorded another subtle change. Women began asking practical questions. When would they be moved? Where would they sleep? What food would be served tomorrow? These questions signaled future-oriented thinking, a psychological shift away from fatalism. The clothing distribution was often cited as the turning point. not because it was generous, but because it was consistent. Clean garments were replaced when worn out. Soap was resupplied. Medical care continued without reversal. Predictability replaced chaos. For people conditioned to expect betrayal, routine itself became reassurance. Yet these improvements carried an undercurrent of tension. Survival raised new anxieties. What would happen after captivity? Would their communities accept them? Would their families view survival as failure? These questions lingered beneath the surface, shaping behavior even as health improved. The immediate aftermath stabilized bodies and quieted fear, but also opened a longer, more uncertain chapter, one that extended far beyond American custody, and followed these women back into a society still struggling to accept what survival now meant. Repatriation did not arrive as a moment of celebration. 4 Japanese women released from American custody. The journey home unfolded slowly, administratively, and without ceremony. Transportation was arranged through Allied occupation channels. Names were checked. Health status confirmed. Groups were moved by ship or rail, often under Red Cross supervision. Each transfer marked another transition, from captivity to uncertainty. Japan in late 1945 was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure had collapsed. Food shortages were severe. Families were scattered or dead. The society these women returned to was no longer governed by the same wartime absolutism, but its moral residues remained. Survival carried complicated meanings. Reintegration was uneven and often painful. Some women were welcomed quietly by relatives grateful simply for their return. Others encountered distance, avoidance, or silence. In communities shaped by years of indoctrination, capture still carried stigma. Questions were asked indirectly, if at all. Many women chose not to answer. Silence became strategy. Few spoke openly about captivity. Fewer still mentioned humane treatment by American forces. To acknowledge it risked social friction. It contradicted narratives that had justified sacrifice and loss. In some cases, women feared being seen as collaborators or moral failures. Clothing lingered as memory. Several post-war interviews conducted decades later described the first American garments as impossible to forget, not because of their appearance, but because of what they represented, the moment when certainty collapsed. Some women recalled discarding the clothes immediately upon return, as if to erase the experience. Others kept small items, socks, buttons, scraps of fabric, hidden away. These objects became private reminders. They marked survival that could not be publicly claimed. They symbolized a moment when the enemy had behaved differently than expected, forcing a reevaluation that could not easily be shared in post-war Japan. Psychological effects persisted. Modern historians and psychologists examining post-war testimony note patterns consistent with trauma shaped by ideological rupture. These women did not only endure war and captivity. They endured the collapse of meaning. What they had been taught to believe about honor, death, and identity no longer held. Rebuilding a sense of self required quiet, individual negotiation. Public memory largely bypassed them. Post-war narratives in Japan focused on devastation, victimhood, and reconstruction. The experiences of women taken captive abroad did not fit neatly into these frameworks. They were neither celebrated nor condemned. They were omitted. In American records, the episode survived in fragments: medical reports, civil affairs logs, Red Cross summaries. The clothing distribution appears only as a practical measure, noted in passing. Its psychological impact was not immediately recognized. Yet history is shaped as much by quiet moments as by decisive battles. For these women, The act of receiving clean clothing marked the beginning of a long internal journey. It did not erase trauma. It did not solve reintegration, but it disrupted a worldview that had demanded death over survival. That disruption mattered because it revealed how fragile total war ideologies become when confronted not with force, but with restraint. When control gives way to dignity. When the expected cruelty never arrives. As memory faded and silence endured, the meaning of that moment remained suspended, waiting to be understood not as anomaly, but as evidence of how war's smallest actions can leave the deepest traces. And it is there, in that suspended space between experience and memory, that reflection must finally begin. In the vast machinery of war, it is often the smallest gestures that carry the most profound weight. The distribution of clean clothing to Japanese women prisoners was, on its surface, a logistical necessity, a matter of hygiene, health, and procedure. Yet in practice, it became an act that reached far deeper, touching the fragile boundaries between power, dignity, and humanity. Clothing, in this context, was more than fabric. It was a marker of identity, a bridge to normalcy, a reassurance that survival need not come at the cost of honor. For women who had been indoctrinated to expect only cruelty and humiliation, receiving garments without coercion or insult challenged the very narratives that had defined their understanding of the enemy and of themselves. A simple dress, a clean shirt, or a pair of socks became instruments of psychological rupture, signaling that mercy could exist even amidst the final chaos of total war. These moments, quiet and unheralded, reveal a side of warfare that often escapes attention. The ethical dimension of human interaction under extreme circumstances. Battles are measured in casualties, territory, and equipment. Yet the moral decisions made in the treatment of those captured can shape not only immediate survival, but long-term memory, resilience, and reconciliation. The American approach, disciplined and consistent, demonstrated that restraint is a form of power, that order, care, and empathy can coexist with military authority. Ultimately, this episode underscores a paradox at the heart of modern warfare. Violence dominates the narrative, yet its absence, when deliberate and structured, can be transformative. The experiences of these women show that even in the most destructive conflict, small acts, grounded in procedure, guided by conscience, can reclaim a fragment of humanity for those who have been stripped of it. In that quiet yard, amid crates and folded garments, the war momentarily shifted. Fear gave way to hesitation. Expectation gave way to reflection. And for the women who survived, and for those who bore witness, a simple act of clothing became a testament to the enduring capacity of human dignity, a reminder that in war, the quietest gestures often echo the longest.